The world was without clear sound. All that could be heard was a penetrating ringing that pierced deep into marrow and bone, yet still sounded like it was muffled through tons of water and layers of fabric as it shook all that was. Everything quaked at the sound. And that glare, a blurry glare that was as blinding as it was impenetrable and frighteningly all-surrounding. Nothing could be seen in any direction. Not left, not right, not over, not under. And then there was pain. Slowly, Curi's consciousness blinked into awareness. An initial blur surrounded them as their optical functions slowly got used to the fact that they were processing incoming information once again. In an instinct that had yet to leave their body, even after many years of being superfluous, they tried to reach one of their short forward arms up to rub at their eyes. However, the appendage was far too short to actually reach their face, and even if it could, there were no eyes left to be scratched there. As they lowered the appendage again to correct their mistake, they slowly adjusted their auditories to their usual levels. There seemed to be no sounds in their room currently, so they had to stick to the adjustments they were used to, instead of adapting it to anything they could actually hear. As they got all their senses back in order, they reflected on the dream they had. Or maybe dream was the wrong term. More of a memory. The sheer amount of thinking and remembering they recently had to do when it came to their own procedures, and the preparations and decisions they had to make while leading up to them, in order to present those reasonably in front of a court of law, had dragged a lot of things back to the surface. Although they had not regretted their operations for a day since they underwent them, they didn't necessarily enjoy remembering the exact moment it happened. Everything around it, sure, but not the specific moment. Because it had been painful, and it had been dangerous, and they had been aware of both of those things before going into it. They had willingly made a decision to endure that pain, willingly decided that it was preferable to what they had, willingly stepped into an operation that they knew might very well be the end of them. And now they would have to officially answer the question of whether or not they were insane to do so. Naturally, the answer was obvious to them. No, they weren't insane. They knew exactly what they were doing and what the consequences might be, and they were far from the only person in the galaxy who decided to put their life in danger for something that they valued more than their current life. Few had ever declared soldiers to be insane for putting their lives on the line for the protection of others, or a weakened parent for wanting to carry their child to term despite the risks associated. The idea of your own life being a commodity that you are able and allowed to wager for the right reason was a well-established thing. That was, of course, also entirely leaving out the fact that, given the right resources, the operations and procedures could have been performed much safer, and had they had the option, Curi would have obviously decided to go with a method that didn't put their health in nearly as big of a jeopardy as they did. But although that was, in their opinion, a clear sign of their sanity as well, they would most likely have to argue with the things that actually happened, not those that may have happened in a different scenario. And, admittedly, they could see the argument, not the logic, but the argument, that the modification of one's own body for a more fulfilling life might be misconstrued as something more selfish than the other examples they came up with on the spot. However, even the thought of that argument being made gave them a sinking feeling in their stomach due to its implications. Because if they were only allowed to wage their own life for those of others, then wouldn't that imply that it wasn't actually their own at all? That the commodity that was their life wasn't actually theirs, but could in reality only be owned by whoever they would happen to pledge it to at some point, if they felt so inclined? That was certainly what the judgment would imply should Curi lose this legal battle with their parents. At least in their mind, it would clearly state that they dared do something selfish with their life that cannot be owned but only given away, and therefore it would be forcibly given away so it may be brought to its intended purpose. They shuddered at the thought of that becoming a reality. The sheer imagination of a galaxy where it was legally decided that your life couldn't be, not just wasn't, but could not be your own, gave them chills. Was that really a place that anyone would want to live in? Curi couldn't imagine so, and they felt like they had a pretty good argument to state their case. However, they had been strongly advised by their legal representation to not, under any circumstances, try to plead their own case without thorough inspection by the experts, and even then it would be better to simply let those experts do the talking as well. This wasn't an argument, it was a legal battle, and as such they had been told the more steadfast logic didn't necessarily apply as a condition for victory. They would have to rely on the exact text of laws first, and on previously set precedents second, and only then would sober logic start playing into things as well. It was disheartening, to say the least, that apparently, no matter how well and ironclad you could phrase your position, it ultimately only mattered as much as it was accounted for in the rules. Admittedly, they had been rather naive about this in the past. They had always figured that laws were clearly established rules one could either obey or break, and there wouldn't be all that much in between. But that was before they had ever had any real contact with the world of courts and laws, or any contact at all. Quickly, the cyborgs shook their body as they felt themselves slipping into a stunning stupor of pondering. As much as their mind tried to drive them to it, they wouldn't figure this out. They couldn't figure this out because there was nothing to figure out. This situation was only about searching, finding, and outmaneuvering. And out of all the things Curi could say that they were quite good at, without it being bragging, this certainly wasn't one of them. Therefore, all they could do was to leave it in the capable hands of those who had pledged their life to this kind of work, while actively supporting them in whatever way they needed, while also keeping their own emotions in check, so they wouldn't make things more difficult than they already were, as hard as that was for them. Therefore, they decided to do their best to not dwell on either the awaiting trial, or their own painful memories of the past, as they moved to their room's exit. They weren't entirely sure yet what they were going to do, now that their friends were forced to leave for a new destination, given that actively working also wasn't a huge option at the moment, since they could technically do some planning and designing, but any more serious experimentation was obviously out of the question. Yet simply going out to see what would happen also wasn't great as an option. Curi had absolutely no delusions about the way other people saw them, and given their current mindset and attempts to stay somewhat positive, they admittedly didn't want to endure the constant stares and hushed comments that were sure to follow them whenever they went out into the public. Even on Mars it had been the case, although the mumblings there had often been of a more interested and curious nature, rather than a disdaining one. Yet what was there left to do? They had never really been one to do something like mindlessly surf through the net, but in this case, maybe they would give it a try. Deciding it was worth a shot at least, they quickly made use of one of the local terminals to connect to the net, and they did their best to mindlessly search around, simply scouring the net for whatever topic came to mind at the moment, or doing their best to steer clear of anything that would lead them down a path that was too negative. It still wasn't for them, but it at least seemed to pass some time, though they probably wouldn't be able to keep this up all day. If they were really into researching something, they could generally get so lost in it that they would only realize that time had passed many, many hours later. However, for that, they needed a very specific drive that had to burn in the back of their head and urge them forwards. And for the last while, that drive just hadn't quite been there. And so they still felt the minutes tick by, as they scrolled across videos, articles, blueprints, or other illustrations. As they were doing that, they constantly found themselves checking the time, feeling as if they were waiting for something to happen, even though there was nothing to really wait for. Their lawyers were giving them regular updates, but that wasn't at any fixed times, and they had absolutely no appointments otherwise. There was nothing to really wait for. Inadvertently, the cyborg thought back to an earlier time. That had not been too long ago, all things considered, but it still felt like another life for them. A time when they had often sat alone in a dark room and watched time go by. A time when they often confined themselves for not going outside in order to avoid the stares they got. First for one reason, and then later for the exact opposite one. A time when they had also avoided contact with people, without thinking much about it back then. Loneliness had never really been a concern for them back then, or at least they had never felt like it had been. It had simply been how things were. The people didn't like what they were, and so they avoided them, and would be left alone in return. That way, everyone would be happy. Except that wasn't true. They now knew it wasn't true, and if they were being honest with themselves, they might have even known back then. Because in reality, no one was happy with that arrangement. Curi was by no means the most social person, but that didn't mean they disliked people. Admittedly, they found other people hard to understand sometimes, and gradually that feeling could overwhelm them so much that they preferred to retreat to momentary solitude in order to gather their thoughts and calm themselves down. But still, they never disliked people. They never disliked company. They thought they did once, but that was before they met people who actually valued them. Once upon a time, Curi had often thought that they didn't care about being disliked. They weren't eager for company anyway, so people disliking them shouldn't mean much in the end. But now they had come to learn that that was not true. It had never been company they disliked. What they disliked was being hated, not being accepted, being ousted. It had made them believe that it was people that made them feel bad, but in actuality it was what people did to them. And as soon as they had met people who valued their company, who liked having them around, and who were glad to be around them, they had learned that the feeling was mutual, that they were fine with being shut away by themselves, but they didn't really like it. It had simply been a reality for them, forged out of constant hostility, and eventually they had begun to accept it. But no, they weren't happy being locked away alone. Happy with being alone every now and then, on their own terms? Sure, but not with having to be alone because that was what was expected of them. And on the other hand, they had learned that everyone else had not been happy with their arrangement either. Because of those people who despised them, who didn't want them around, who wanted them to be away. They weren't happy with them just locking away in a room by themselves. They were not happy with Curi just doing their own thing and leaving everyone else alone while being alone themselves. Because by now, Curi had learned that it was not enough for those people that they did not have to be around Curi. It wasn't enough for them that Curi was alone. It wasn't enough for them that they had it all, and Curi only had their own little room. The cyborgs still couldn't understand it by any means. They couldn't wrap their head around it, couldn't figure it out. But they had learned that even all that was not enough for those people. Learned that their very existence, them just being, not even being there, but being at all, somehow presented such a grave offense to those people that a number of them somehow saw it as their duty to take it upon themselves, to take revenge for that insult, to correct that mistake. Some of them more directly so, like the ones that had sabotaged their experiment in an attempt to take their life away for the offense of wanting to live it how Curi themselves saw fit. Much like they had done with Optiferae. A single cold, calculated, and most of all brutal action to rid the world of the current target of their ire. Meanwhile others, or maybe even the same, tried to go about it another way. The legal way, like their own parents were doing now. They didn't like that someone like Curi existed, so they were simply going to try and forbid them from existing. To forcefully change them into something else, and to pretend, and maybe even believe, that they had justice on their side in the process. And once existence was established as an unlawful act for one of them, that could quickly be turned into a precedent to do the same for all of them. A much wider spread approach than attacking them one by one, which was exactly why Curi knew that this was something that they could, under no circumstances, allow to come to pass. Maybe they had been naive on quite a few issues in the past, and maybe they still were, but they certainly weren't dumb. They could see the connections between things, the logical through line, and in this case it all spelled out that this wasn't just about them. For their parents, maybe it was. Curi doubted that they had some sort of bigger plan behind their actions. They didn't even know what exactly they stood to gain out of their attempt at getting control over Curi yet. But whatever it was, they were sure it didn't reach much further than that. But that didn't mean that it wasn't still a dangerous tool for what other people may be planning. After all, a precedent is a precedent. They couldn't allow that to happen. And they weren't going to allow that to happen. If there was one thing that they had truly learned about during this short time that they had spent discovering their true feelings on this world, then it was persistence. The same persistence they once had when they went after their dream of their current body. The same perseverance that had once driven them forwards on their search for what beauty truly meant for them, and what it would take for them to finally feel what everyone else saw in them for themselves. And the same perseverance that they saw in all those that had surrounded them in these recent times. Obviously, both their resolution to keep their thoughts positive and their scrolling had fallen severely by the wayside at this point, and it probably would have remained that way had it not been for the loud bell of their door disturbing their thoughts. And judging by the frequency and length of the ringing, it had probably not been utilized for the first time when they realized that it was going off. Someone was apparently getting impatient with them. Briefly orienting themselves after having gotten lost in their own thoughts, Curi slowly approached the door, though for a moment they wondered if they should be worried about who was going to be standing out there. Legally, they shouldn't really be. After all, their opposition in the trial wasn't allowed to make any direct contact with them, and instead had to clear up everything they may have needed with Curi's lawyers instead. But still, that didn't mean that there couldn't have been an unpleasant surprise waiting for them. Still, after the frenzy of motivation they had thought themselves into just now, for once in their life, Curi wasn't actively out to avoid all confrontation, and so they sped up their steps and quickly opened the hatch in the room's roof. But whatever unpleasant visitors Curi may have expected to await them out there, it wasn't who they actually found outside. The cyborg had to look further up than they expected to finally meet the face of their visitor. A familiar but not yet well-known Raphaelite, whose long, surprisingly smooth fur had a light colour. Moore's daughter, Kenta, nervously scratched along her notched horn with her claw, causing a loud clacking sound as she operated the doorbell one more time before noticing that the door had been opened for her. Her large brown eye widened a bit as she tilted her head to the side to look more directly at the cyborg, and there was clear hesitation behind her gaze, though admittedly she at least managed to suppress it to a polite degree. "Hello," Curi greeted, still surprised that their friend's offspring would visit them without any announcement like this. "Hello, Curi," Kenta greeted them back, a bit more properly than they had done themselves. Seemingly forcing herself to stop her nervous clacking, he brought her hand down and firmly gripped a part of her arm fur with it to hold it still before she cleared her throat. Still, she stumbled over her words for a moment before really finding what she wanted to say. I mean, you do... Oh, darn it. Ahem. Before she left the station, my mother has asked me and my siblings to stay for a bit, to make sure that you would have anything you needed while you have to remain here, if possible. Since you are her friend and all that. I was told at the welcoming area that you have not yet left your room or made any orders for anything today. I just wanted to ask if there was anything you would like me to get for you, if you're not feeling like going out or the things that the Hive provides for you. In a reaction that Curi had rarely felt, at least in this specific form, the cyborg quickly replied before they had even really thought about it, or made any rationale for themselves. I do not wish to remain inside, they stated clearly, while looking up at the Raphaelite. Kenta seemed stunned for a moment, but then her grip on her own fur slowly lessened. Curi couldn't quite tell what it was, but something about their reaction seemed to have instantly gotten through to the woman. "Oh," she said, as her arm slowly sank down. "And you would like me to accompany you? Where would you like to go?" "Anywhere," Curi replied. "Anywhere is good."